Hello, everyone. We're on the air. Here I am with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Miles Smith. You want to say hello, Miles?
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It's great to be with you again. We're about to start one of our conversation series on the YouTube channel. And Alex, these chats or these kind of podcasts are really overview takes on topics that we cover more thoroughly in our courses. Did you want to tell everyone about the course offerings we have at the Petrarch Institute?
Yeah, so I mean, you know, we're running right now, you know, our course on classical philosophy and the virtues. We have a course on rhetoric. We have a course on Nietzsche and Socrates. We have a planned course for 2018 on classical drama. So we're getting quite a nice number of offerings, I hope, and we've gotten good reviews for the courses so far. So I would strongly invite anyone who's interested to use the email which is given at the bottom of this video. Drop me an email if you think you may be interested in our courses in the future. These discussions are really just sort of teasers for more in-depth treatments of topics. I was thinking, as we are now in the Advent season, moving toward Christmas, and that it would be an interesting topic to do something about the classical tradition, the classical Greco-Roman tradition, and Christianity, and the advent of Christianity. And I think that those are sort of two very central elements in the Western tradition. If you think about the oscillations in European history, right? Let's say from the Renaissance, which strongly emphasized the Greco-Roman tradition to the point that you had popes with paintings of the muses in their libraries and so forth, and the great resurgence of Greco-Roman culture. And then you had the Reformation, which was emphasizing the biblical tradition. We could see that there's been this great oscillation between, let's say, the biblical culture and the Greco-Roman culture as these two traditions which have really been formative of Europe and the West. So I thought it would be an interesting topic to discuss. So, Miles, did you have any thoughts of your own on the topic before we start going through the itinerary?
Well, I think it's an interesting topic to take up because we've covered a fair amount of ground in this series on topics that relate to classical education and classical learning, but theology as an important backdrop and contributor and component of the rounded body of classical wisdom and knowledge is sometimes overlooked. So it's nice to redress that. And also, by way of a test bed, Alex, I think that if there's sufficient interest, this is a topic which we could build out as a course. So if I understand correctly, they can let you know in the comments section if there is a demand for us to take what we cover in this two-part podcast or video chat and build it out as a course. So let us know if that's something that you want to hear more about in depth.
Yeah,
what
no.
are we going to talk about today?
Please comment if you find this topic of interest, and if there's enough, if it generates enough interest, I would be very happy to do a full course at Petrarch for it. And remember, you know, the prices are not too shabby. You know, you can order the course for £35. So just keep that in mind. So, like as Miles kind of alluded to, it's something we don't often think about when people say theology. People often think of Christian theologians and stuff. Like, people sometimes forget that the very concept of theology came from the Greeks. Specifically, the first time that we have any record of it being used was in, I believe, in Plato's Republic. From these two roots of to theon, or God, the divine, and logos, right, which has a number of translations, but perhaps the rational discourse or something like that. So that I think still expresses what the essence of theology is: rational discourse concerning the divine. And maybe one way I think the first topic that I would want to discuss is the different kinds of theology that were available or which were part of the discourse of the classical world. Marcus Varro, who unfortunately his text exists only in a somewhat fragmentary form, was a Republic era Roman writer, and he distinguishes in his work between three kinds of theology, right? So there is mythic theology, which we could say is the theology of the poets. There is political theology, which is, let's say, the official cult, right? The idea, let's say, of the gods as the protectors of the city, like Athena was for Athens, and the gods of Rome, right? The way in which politics and religion were very closely intertwined in the classical world. And the third, which we'll spend the most time discussing because it's of most interest to our topic, is rational or natural theology, which remained a discourse through the Middle Ages and beyond. So in this segment, we're going to first discuss Greek theology, and then in part two, we'll discuss the encounter between the Greeks and the Jews and Christians after the time of Alexander, which seems to be the first time we have any significant record of these two discourses crossing paths, as it were. So let me discuss, first of all, let's say so we have these two modes of discourse: mythos, myth, the mythic or poetic discourse, and we have logos, right, the rational kind of discourse. Let me discuss first a little bit on let's say the mythic discourse, which is, I think, important for understanding Greek and Greco-Roman popular religion. So we're talking here largely about the religion of the poets, right? Think of Homer and Hesiod and so forth, right? And these are remember that the poets for the ancient Greeks would be sort of mediators between the divine and the human. We can think of the poets in a way analogous maybe in the Hebrew world to the prophets, right? Homer, right, calls upon the muses. And so the ancient Greek religion belongs to the family of Indo-European religions, right? Basically, in very ancient times, right, it's believed that one group of people went into Europe and another group went into the Indus Valley. And so probably the most significant living example of Indo-European religion today would be Hinduism, right? And anthropologists have sort of reconstructed what the proto-Indo-European religion was likely about, right? Was right, because there's these common themes, right? The emergence of the cosmos from a primeval chaos. There's the idea of nature being divided into provinces, as it were, over which different gods look over. So almost all of them will have a celestial god, whether it's Indra in India, or Odin among the Germans, or Zeus, or Jupiter, right? So there's the celestial in the heavens. There's the telluric, or the earthly. So in the Greek mythology, Zeus is celestial. The earthly is really sort of Poseidon, because he rules not only over the seas, which is what he's most associated with, but also earthquakes and so forth, right? So he's sort of this telluric god. And then the underworld, the chthonic level, right? Hades, right? The three brothers. And Hesiod, in his work, The Theogony, tells the story of the dynasties of the gods, right? And there's really this overarching theme here, again, of this idea of the emergence of the cosmos, or the law-governed universe, from the chaos, right? So that the Titans are overthrown ultimately by the Olympian gods and so forth, right? And so there's these different dynastic orders and revolutions and so forth within the cosmic order. And so two of the things that I think are important, because there's not an absolute separation between the mythic and the philosophical. between the poetic and the mythological. So some of the ideas will sort of carry through into the concerns of the philosophers. Is this idea, first of all, of cosmology, right? So Greek thought will evince this very strong emphasis on discerning the cosmic order, right? And what is man's place within this order. And the other is this idea of a law-governed system, right? Nature and the universe as a law-governed and indeed a just system, because Hesiod makes clear that even if human justice doesn't see you, Zeus sees you, right? So what emerges at the end of his system is this idea of a natural law or a natural justice, a cosmic law or cosmic justice, we could say. And these themes recur also in the philosophical systems. There were also various mystery religions, but I think I'll probably leave that to the side for reasons of space. So, Miles, should I move now over to the philosophers?
I think so, because I think you've already made it clear that there's a kind of a segue that the philosophers not only pay tribute to the poets for the sake of authority and persuasion, but that the poets are actually seeking the kind of structure and separation and order which is at the heart of classicism. So it's almost like the combination of the orderly and the dynamic in the Baroque, right? It's a kind of a style which is harmonic, but as opposed to being a distinction of two things, it's almost the wedding or the creative fusion of two things from two different directions. If you think that's fair,
yeah.
So I think
I mean, one can go into these topics in all kinds of levels of depth, and maybe if we do a course, we can discuss it further. But Francis Cornford wrote a book on the origins of Western speculation from the Greek religion, right? Showing how the themes of the philosophers were sort of prefigured in the Greek poets. So it's a fertile theme. But I think one of the most, from the standpoint of Christians and other monotheists, probably the most interesting aspect of the Greek philosophers, which maybe we also don't associate a lot with the Greeks, is the emergence of speculative theism or speculative monotheism. And this really emerges out of the general interest of the early Greek philosopher from earliest times, the early interest of the Greek philosophers in this problem of the one and the many, right? So there's this idea of nature as consisting in a multiplicity of things, and yet there's this quest for what is the one principle underlying all these things. So sometimes, as in the early Ionians, this was thought of in terms of some sort of element, right? Did everything arise from water, right? I think even Homer suggests Oceanus and so forth. But very, very soon these ideas get associated with divine principles, or at least some sort of, like, for example, even as early as Anaximander, he thinks the one principle is the boundless or the infinite, right? So very early we start seeing this association. Parmenides takes it to a new level. He thinks the only ultimate reality is the one, right? Is the one being, right? So, but we have this association in Parmenides with the changeless and the eternal as being where true reality lies, which is an enduring theme in Greek philosophy. And then on the other side, we have Heraclitus, the philosopher of becoming, and the term he uses, even Heraclitus thinks there's a single overarching principle, which he calls, perhaps for the first time among the Greeks, the logos, right? The divine immanent principle, which is also something a bit taken over from the poets as well. The idea that the divine is somehow immanent in the cosmic order. And he identifies it as this divine principle of logos as being fire, right? Perhaps because of its dynamic nature. And then you have Anaxagoras, who identifies the cosmic principle with nous, or mind, right? So the idea of a divine mind, as it were, which is the principle of cosmic intelligibility. And then you have Xenophanes, right, who in striking verse speaks of one God, greatest among gods and humans, like mortals, neither in form nor in thought, but mortals thinks that the gods are born and have the mortal's own clothes and voice and form, right? We already have with Xenophanes this critique of anthropomorphism, right? He says humans make gods after their own image, right? And he says that the Ethiopians would make the gods black, and the animals would make, if their horses could worship something, they'd make horse gods and so forth, right? But he says that actually there's one highest god, or one highest being, which underlies everything. So I think I'll next move on to Plato, right? Perhaps one of the first philosophers of whom we have very extensive, far more than fragmentary poetry and so forth, right? Very extensive. We basically have all his dialogue. So did you want to comment anything on what I've said so far, Miles, before I move on to Plato?
No, that's a great overview.
Okay, so with Plato is the inventor of the term or the concept of philosophy. I mean, sorry, theology. Much of his philosophy is related to the themes we already discussed with the pre-Socratics. So, for example, in the Republic, he is reconceptualizing paideia, Greek education or culture, as a topic we've touched on in various points, not as simply preparation for civic life, right? But as the turning of the soul from the changing world to the divine, right? To the divine, changeless, immortal realm, right? So it's important, first of all, to realize that Plato has a very robust sense of the immortality of the soul as something different from the body, which was something very influential also in Christianity, Platonic ideas about the soul, and he believes very strongly in the existence of this divine principle, which he calls the to agathon, the good, right? As it were, capital, right? And he says that in his Republic, and taking this from the Loeb edition, he says, the sun, I presume you will say, not only furnishes to visibles the power of visibility, but also provides for their generation and growth and nurture, though it is not itself generation. Of course not, right? In like manner, then, you are to say that the objects of knowledge not only receive from the presence of the good, their being known, but their very existence and essence is derived to them from it, though the good itself is not essence, but still transcends essence in dignity and surpassing powers. So we have this idea in Plato of there being a divine principle, which is the source of everything else, and yet which is above it, right? Which transcends every essence of every other being, and yet is the source of everything, as well as of its intelligibility. And in his Timaeus, this divine being appears as the demiurgos, right? The fashioner of the cosmos. And in his Symposium, he talks about the divine beauty as being reflected in the visible beauty of the cosmic order, right? So he says the true order of going is to use the beauties of earth as steps along which one mounts upward for the sake of that other beauty, capital beauty. And he talks about paideia as wheeled around from the perishing world, the contemplation of the real world and the brightness thereof, right? So he's imagining the soul ascending from the changing and sensuous realities of this world, ascending to the contemplation of the divine, which is really the true theology, right? The apprehension of the changeless divine. And in Plato's successors, such as Plotinus, you have even, let's say, spiritual practices designed to bring the soul of man into contact with the divine being, right? So Plotinus says he says, if a man could preserve the memory of what he was when he mingled with the divine, he would have within himself an image of God. For then nothing stirred within him, neither anger, nor desire, nor even reason, nor a certain intellectual perception, nor in short was he himself moved, if we may assert this, but being in ecstasy, tranquil and alone with God, he enjoyed an unbreakable calm, right? And it's important to note that early church fathers like Augustine, among many others, were profoundly influenced by the Neoplatonic tradition. And Plato, I should say, in the history of Christianity, came back many, many times, including during the Renaissance, with the translations of Plato's works by Marsilius Ficino. So there was many, many schools of Christian Platonism, right? So the classical tradition didn't end with so it's just important to note that classical tradition continued on through the Christian epoch. Now, we should also turn to Aristotle, right? So Aristotle will divide the speculative sciences. In his Metaphysics, he divides the speculative sciences into three types, right? So they are those which are not separable from matter and which are changing, which is natural philosophy, right? The study of the natural order. There are those which are separable in the understanding, but not in the reality, which is the mathematical. And then there is the highest, which he calls theology, right? And he says, for it is obvious that if the divine exists anywhere, it exists in this kind of nature, right? So Aristotle will say that the highest science will be theology, the science which studies the divine, the highest being. And Aristotle will strongly affirm the existence of this hou kanoimenon kinei, right? The unmoved mover, the mover of the cosmos, not itself moved, right? He says there must be something which causes motion and is unmoved, which is eternal and both a substance and an actuality, right? So God is a necessary part of the Aristotelian system, but he will also say that God is sort of the final end of all existence as well, right? And in his Metaphysics. And it's important to say also that he thinks of God also as providing a kind of moral or ethical standard, right? So he will say of the highest or best life in the Nicomachean Ethics, not in virtue of his humanity will a man achieve it, but in virtue of something within him that is divine. And by as much as this something is superior to his composite nature, by so much as its activity superior to the exercise of the other forms of virtue. If then the intellect is something divine in comparison with man, so is the life of the intellect divine in comparison with human life. So what Aristotle conceives of as the highest life, the life which includes not only the moral virtues, but the exercise of reason itself in the intellectual or theoretic life, this will be a life not only which has God as its object, but will be itself a life akin to the divine, right? Because he thinks of God as being a pure thought. So God provides sort of a standard for the ethical life as well. And you'll see similar passages as well in his Eudemian ethics. Now, I should just say something very briefly about post-Aristotelian philosophy. Probably the most important in this capacity to mention would be the Stoics, right? There's a couple of important things to mention about the Stoics, right? Well, vast influence on the Romans and later on Christian thinkers as well. So they take up this idea that began with Heraclitus of the Logos, this divine reason or divine principle, which is immanent in the cosmic order. And they will say that also this Logos is present in us, right? And it's what allows us to understand the natural law, for example, which is not only the physical laws, but also the moral laws of the universe. And they will emphasize cosmopolitanism, which is kind of a feature of the post-Aristotelian world. The cosmos, right? The cosmic order, and the polis, the city. The whole cosmos is our city. So that means all humanity has this logos, right? which is the source of their, let's say, dignity, right, and kinship in a way to the divine. And so the moral law binds all, is universal, it is unchanging, absolute, and it binds all human beings, right? Which we would call natural law or natural justice. And this idea was inherited by the Romans. So Cicero was very influenced by the Stoics, and he talks in his work De Republica about the idea of a natural law which would bind even when there's no civil law, right? Let's say that you shouldn't steal from people, you shouldn't kill people, you shouldn't, there's a set of laws which remain binding, whether or not the civil law is at its best a mere copy of the natural law. So I think that covers a bit on the surveyed a bit on the rather rapid survey on the Greco-Roman thought and theology. Did you have any thoughts, Miles? Well,
I like the way we ended with Cicero, because in some ways I think that's an antecedent of Augustine in a way, just in terms of that theme of continuity that we began to point to in terms of Greek philosophy and theology as having kinship with the Jewish religion and in some ways anticipating Christianity. I think Augustine starts to crystallize the attitude of the monotheist religion towards that classical heritage when talking about the despoiling of Egypt, which is to say you take gold wherever you find it. So truth in natural philosophers, in Greek religion, is to be embraced. And I think he said similarly in his enthusiastic reading of Cicero and some of the Stoic writings that the only thing he saw missing was the name of Christ. So there's that strong sense that the natural speculative theology is a big part of what emerges in Christianity and has strong affinities with Judaism. And also, I just to summarize what you gave in this very dense and interesting overview we've just had, what I hear are a couple of trends emerging in Greek religion and theology and growing through the classical tradition. One is a change from the gods as expressing mere power towards evincing justice. And also a kind of the emergence of the individual as something known by God, as an individual, as having kind of survivable meaning in the divine, so that there's a spark of the divine in the individual person and an immortality as a result in the individual person, rising above the merely natural, just as the gods themselves rise above flux or chaos and above the merely natural. God or the gods, it's sort of the same. I guess in Greek, that word Zeus is a cognate for Deus or Dios or God, basically. So there's a henotheistic tendency, and that is increasingly in this Greek tradition we've been talking about a kind of basis or ground for knowledge and justice and goodness and beauty. Is that fair?
Yeah. So I mean, I think there's a couple of themes that emerge. Yeah, I mean, one thing to note is, curiously, right, although Aristotle, the nature of Greek monotheism, right, I mean, although Aristotle believes in a single God who's the foundation of the cosmic order, he didn't seem to see a necessarily conflict between that and the public cultist, because in his will, I think he discusses Demeter and stuff like that. One fulfilled one's pious duties as a citizen. Although, how he reconciled that, we don't know, but perhaps he thought that they were sort of lesser divine beings or something like that. But I think for our purposes, yeah, you touched on some of the, I think, important themes. So we have the idea of the God of metaphysics who underlies the cosmic order. We have the theme of God as sort of the final cause. We have the theme of the immortality of the soul, and in Plato also reward and punishment, right? This is in the Phaedo. He discusses the fate of the wicked and the reward given to the good. And you have also the ethical, the role of the gods, natural law, the idea of natural law, and the role of the gods as providing of God really as providing an ethical standard. So all these things will be part of the continued inheritance. as we go forward. So I think that hopefully provides some summation.
Excellent. So Alex, what do people have to look forward to in part 2 of this conversation coming up shortly?
Yeah, so I'm going to survey the interactions between the Greco-Roman world, particularly the Greek world, we could say Greek thought, and the heritage of Israel and then of Christianity as they move from, I think I titled it From Conflict to Confluence, right? I think we'll see initial tensions and ultimate synthesis, which is really the synthesis which underlies Western civilization, we could say. So, so I hope people enjoy it and look forward to producing it.
We look forward to seeing you in the next installment.
Okay, very good. Take care, everyone.